The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
In the last major ideological global showdown, capitalism faced off against communism. Could the next such battle be democracy versus kleptocracy? Tonight, the rise of dirty money as an agent of corruption in the international order and within democratic states, too. Also tonight, Ukraine is one of the great breadbaskets of the world. Will the war there result in a global food emergency? We'll examine that. It's Thursday, April 7th, and that's tonight on The Agenda. If there was a time when corruption and malfeasance seemed to be primarily problems of petty dictators in faraway lands, the world has lost its naivete about that, particularly as light shone on the Russian oligarchs amid the war in Ukraine. The problem of global kleptocracy now has our attention. With us to explain, in Hey on Why United Kingdom, Oliver Bullough, journalist and author of Butler to the World: How Britain Became the Servant of Tycoons, Tax Dodgers, Kleptocrats, and Criminals. In Devon, also in the United Kingdom, Tom Burgess, investigative reporter at the Financial Times and author of Kleptopia: How Dirty Money is Conquering the World. And in Washington, D.C., Sarah Chayes, author of On Corruption in America and What is at Stake. She's a former special advisor to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen. And we're very happy to have you three with us here on TVO tonight. Let me just read back a couple of lines that each of you has had to say. Oliver, in 2020, you wrote that, quote, kleptocracy is for the 21st century what fascism and communism were for much of the 20th. And Tom, last month you said the most dangerous threat to our freedom is the rise of kleptocracy. And you said that, incidentally, on the courthouse steps in London right after you won a libel case filed by some of the kleptocrats that you wrote about in your book. So, okay, we've had Oliver and Tom have their say, so Sarah, you get the first kick at this question. Let's define what we're talking about here. Kleptocracy, what is it?
It is the capture of the politics and economy of a country by a network that includes members of government, business tycoons, and very often out-and-out criminals. And the people in this network who control levers of power don't just use those levers of power to enrich themselves. They also bend and twist the agencies and institutions that they run so that those government agencies serve not the people, but the kleptocrats and their addiction to infinite wealth.
Oliver, follow up on that, if you would, by telling us why you believe kleptocracy has been the defining feature of this century in the way that, say, fascism and communism were the evils of the last century.
Well, the great difference between kleptocracy and the two great autocracies of the 20th century is the fact that it's so much a product of a globalized financial system. The fact that it is now so easy to steal large amounts of money and to hide that money in the nooks and crannies of the offshore financial system through financial centers like London is essentially, it results in a system which isn't just a problem over there. It's also a problem right here, whether right here is Canada or right here is the UK or right here is the US or any other Western country, because the money flows out of places like Russia or China or Afghanistan or Nigeria, and it flows out of those places into Western capitals via the financial system with the assistance of lawyers and accountants and so on in our own countries. And when it's here, it can buy influence and in a way that essentially makes it much harder to fight against than the dictatorships of the past.
We will come back to that angle of how the West is enabling all of this a little further in our discussion. But Tom, you've got this line that you've said, the thieves are uniting. What do you mean by that?
Well, let me take you back for a moment, as I do in Kleptopia, to the Zimbabwean election of 2008. There was an extraordinary thing that was about to happen then. Robert Mugabe was about to lose power in an election. Indeed, he did lose an election. But Robert Mugabe doesn't lose elections, so he had to mobilize his thuggery machine to make sure that his kleptocracy would remain in power. Now that costs money. You have to buy supplies, weapons. You have to pay people off, to incentivize people to deploy violence. And he got $100 million. And where did he get that $100 million? He got it from taking hold of a mine, handing that mine to control of an offshore company of the kind Oliver describes, that was controlled by one of his business cronies, a white Zimbabwean, and then that mine was moved to through a corporate deal to a London-listed mining company, with the backing of a Wall Street hedge fund. Mugabe used that money, brutalized the opposition, stole that election, and remained in power for another 12 years, another quarter of a lifetime, if you're unfortunate enough to be a Zimbabwean living under his rule. And then this Zimbabwean mine and a few other African assets were packaged together and ended up under the control of some Central Asian oligarchs with connections going back to the KGB and a regime that has links to Donald Trump. Now, you put that together, that's just one example of how around the world, both in countries we recognize as kleptocracies like Zimbabwe or Russia, but also in the great capitals of democracy, London, Washington, and so on, these networks of power that Sarah describes have gone global, and they are hoarding power and wealth in such a way that it's becoming utterly unaccountable. The rule of law has not gone global. That has stayed within nation states. And we are reaching up into the ether, trying to hold people like Putin and his allies in the West to account, but often finding that what we hold on to vanishes within our grasp because we have allowed this secrecy system to take hold.
Well, Sarah, could you follow up on that in this regard? Is kleptocracy and the oligarchs that employ it, or who are responsible for it, is this a kind of a natural outcome of globalization in your view?
I think the two are intertwined. I think that you saw a major shift in culture around the year 1980, where money once again, as it had at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, money in and of itself became increasingly the sole marker of social status. So you start seeing the kind of adoration of wealth starting again. And then the deregulation and globalization wave of the 1990s really made the amassing and, as both Tom and Oliver have said, the hiding away and transferring across national boundaries of this accumulated wealth much, much easier. And so I think the two are very closely combined. And I also think the network building did happen in a particular way in the former Soviet space, where you had the former government officials who were in charge of giving people favors, the people who had begun to experiment with being entrepreneurs in the West, had gotten to understand how the Western banking and legal systems worked, and then the out and out kind of Russian mafia wove themselves together into the type of transnational networks that we're all discussing.
Well, Oliver, you actually go back to pre-globalization days. You make reference to the Suez Crisis in 1956. How come? What's important about that?
Well, I mean, you need essentially a network, as Sarah said, and a network requires or requires a physical architecture for that network to run through. The money needs wires down which the messages can move. It needs social connections, people who know each other, bankers that know each other. This is criminal wealth. This is illicit activity. They need to trust each other. And that network was born out of the dying embers of the British Empire. The British Empire had the network, it just no longer existed, but the people still all knew each other. And the thing that the Suez Crisis did, this diplomatic fiasco that brought the British Empire essentially to an end, certainly it was what made the end of the British Empire inevitable, also gave birth to this curious phenomenon whereby the pound largely ceased to be used as an international currency because of restrictions placed on its use by the British government. And the bankers in London, in the desperate search for a new way of making a living, switched to using the dollar. And when they used the dollar in London, they made this amazing discovery, which is that by using a dollar in the UK, there were no British rules because they weren't using British currency. And there were no American rules because they weren't acting in the United States. They had created essentially a legal hole within a country where no rules applied. And they needed a concept to describe what they'd done. What had they discovered? And they used a concept from maritime law. Essentially, what happens if you move out of the reach of a country's jurisdiction, out onto the high seas, you are offshore. You are no longer somewhere where it's subject to the rules of government. And so this concept, offshore, the legal spaces, which are essentially outside any government's control, are tolerated by governments because they are profitable, because they bring business to their bankers and to their lawyers and their accountants and so on. And they essentially provide loopholes through which initially just dollars could flow, but increasingly anything can flow. The giant kleptocratic networks that the other two have been talking about essentially exist because of their ability to hide their wealth in and through and around these loopholes, which were first opened up in the City of London thanks to the Suez Crisis, but now have spread far more widely throughout the last remaining bits of the British Empire, places like the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, Gibraltar, and so on, but also to other places, South Dakota, improbable places like South Dakota, more probable places like Hong Kong, Singapore, Cyprus. It is an entire network of centers all around the world, joined together by modern communications, and money flows between them in the flash of a photon. And when before the police have even got out of bed, the criminal wealth has gone around the world 3 or 4 times, and it's almost impossible to find it again.
Well, Tom, let's see if we can figure out a little bit more about who they are. You told us in your first answer, as it related to Zimbabwe, it was a very rich person who owned a mine. Who else are we talking about here?
Well, I mean, typically what we're talking about is a dictator and their entourage. So they tend to fit a pattern of people who've seized control of oil, gas or mineral-rich countries. As far as the global economy is concerned, the way to make real money in most of Africa, Latin America, and large parts of Asia is to capture the basic resources of the global economy and do deals with Western multinationals that will treat you as the legitimate person to sell those. So some of the list is long, but there are a few prominent faces in that rogues gallery. I mentioned Mugabe. Obviously, Putin is the sort of king kleptocrat because he's done such an extraordinary job of fusing kleptocracy and foreign policy, whether it be using gas or using disinformation or using missiles. The Chinese Communist Party has shown itself to be pretty kleptocratic and does. And under Xi Jinping has done one of the classic maneuvers of kleptocracy, which is to use the quasi-anti-corruption campaign as a weapon to take out your enemy. So in a system where everybody is corrupt, obviously you can accuse anyone you want of corruption, and there'll be some pretty good evidence to support that. I think one really important point to make, really important, perhaps the most important thing to remember, is that kleptocracy is not geographical. It's simply the use of power, it's a systematic use of power for the enrichment of those who hold power. Now, just as there are Democrats, brave Democrats in Moscow, there are very much kleptocrats in Washington and London and the other capitals of democracy. And I would say the biggest one of all in recent years is Donald Trump. Part of what I try to show in my book, Kleptopia, is how Trump, for many, many years, when he was essentially pretending to be a businessman, he was a hopeless businessman, but he was sustained in his property career by flows of dark money from the former Soviet Union, from the great engine of the global kleptocracy. And combine that with a successful turn in reality television as a kind of business genius. And you have the recipe for his presidential run. And then in office, he governs as a kleptocrat. He knows which side his bread is buttered on. He knows which forces have been sustaining him for so long. And and he joins the club. Look at his allies in office. His friendship with Putin, Kim in the Kim dynasty in North Korea, another
I think
great
none of this, though,
kleptocracy, and
Tom,
so on.
I think none of this is going to shock anybody. However,
No,
I heard
but,
Oliver.
but if I can just come back on that point, I do think it shocks people because I don't think people think of it in this way. I think people get, as with Putin, people get distracted by the rhetoric. They think of these people as nationalists, as populists, right? But that is the diversion. What's actually going on is corruption. And that's what it's so crucial to get through Putin or Trump's kind of nationalist bombast and look at what the engine of their power actually is, and that's just self-enrichment.
Well, I was going to say, Sarah, I mean, your book's called On Corruption in America, and it may not come as a shock to many people watching or listening to this that Trump is on the list, but Oliver just mentioned South Dakota. I mean, there are kleptocrats in South Dakota?
So I'd like to make a distinction because I think that we, even now, even as you say, Steve, that we are beginning to think about kleptocracy much more seriously than we did before, the end of February, there's still a tendency to see the kleptocrats as being over there, right? Over there in kind of exotic places like Angola or Afghanistan or Nigeria or Russia even. Whereas, and to see our sin in the West as largely being a sin of enablers. And I think that is the last piece of this that we really need to break down and understand that not only are our bankers and real estate agents and registered agents and whatnot, lawyers, assisting, quote, the kleptocrats over there, the rogues gallery. But in fact, our own systems are increasingly resembling the systems that we can find in a place like Nigeria or Afghanistan or Russia. And by that, I mean, take a look at the interconnected, interwoven webs that dominate our own politics and economies. And often we talk about some of these countries that are beset by kleptocracy as fragile or failing states. And I think that what the three of us would all agree is to say that, well, yeah, they're failing as states, but their kleptocratic networks are incredibly successful at enriching themselves. Well, I'm speaking to you from Washington, right? Mm-hmm. So around this city is this forest of massive McMansions. And they are largely owned by people from the defense industry, people from the financial services industry, people who lobby for those industries or for the fossil fuel industry, or let's say medical giants, right? Now let's take a look at the policies that we've seen that these very executives and their lobbyists have either influenced or themselves in office promulgated. And we see, a financial meltdown that starts to approach the Great Depression in magnitude in 2008. We see 2 lost wars. We see, a very botched response to a global pandemic. And we see, the collapse of our living ecosystem around us. And what I would ask us is, are we not also starting to look almost like a state that's being destroyed, being turned into a failing state by its kleptocratic leaders? And it is Trump, but it's not only Trump.
Well, Oliver, if our actions are helping to enable kleptocrats to do their thing around the world and at home, why are we enabling it? Why are we doing it?
Well, I think Sarah's made a very good point here. I mean, let's face it, Putin, for all of his friendship with certain Western politicians, whether that's Viktor Orban in Hungary or Nigel Farage in London, or indeed Donald Trump in the US, he doesn't have a very big lobby in Western capitals. Neither do any of the kleptocrats, really. Who does have a big lobby are the big corporations, the big tech giants, and the very wealthy Western entrepreneurs and billionaires. And they love using exactly the same networks as Putin and the Chinese oligarchs or the Nigerian oligarchs use. They move their money through the same offshore tax havens. They move their money through the same kind of financial instruments. I mentioned South Dakota, which has this curiously large trust industry, which has grown up particularly in the last 10 or 15 years. Yes, that's popular with Chinese billionaires, but it's overwhelmingly popular with American billionaires. They like dodging taxes as much as the next man, if not rather more. And that is the real challenge for Western governments to face, is this gradual erosion of the principle of everyone being equal before the law and everyone being equal before the tax authorities, because there are so many loopholes which are available only to people who can afford them. So, if the problem was only Putin or even President Xi and their financial skullduggery, I think we'd be able to solve that. They don't have that many defenders when the chips are down. The problem is that essentially they are piggybacking onto a system that was created by Western corporations, allowing Western corporations to evade tax or avoid tax on an industrial scale thanks to jurisdictions like Bermuda and so on. And that's the real challenge, because there are very, very few Western governments who are prepared to face up to our own kleptocrats, the corporations who are, if they're not actually stealing things, it's only because we've made what they do legal.
Well, Tom, just so I'm clear, are we making an equivalent here, an equivalency between Russian-style kleptocracy and what goes on, for example, in London, UK, or in Washington, D.C.? Because certainly my sense is the public's view of this would be that's a level of kleptocracy in the Russian capital that is quite a bit different from what we're experiencing in the West. But is it different?
Well, I think the point one of the points we're all three driving at is to say that it's a mistake to see these things geographically. We live in a global economy, and so, if we talk about the Russian kleptocracy, what do we really mean there? That some of the biggest corporate players, certainly until very, very recent times, were in the Russian economy were Western oil companies. I mean, how do we think they secured their access and contracts in a notoriously corrupt regime?
They cut in Mr. Putin for 50% of everything, is what we hear.
Well, yes, but we also hear that there are subtler elements to it than that. I mean, sure, there occasionally we see a straight up bribery case. One of them comes to light. The Department of Justice in the US gets a whistleblower, whatever it may be, and we see under the bonnet of the global economy, if you like. But I think that the point I'm driving at is that whether it be, as Oliver says, by advancing Russian causes through lobbying in Washington by an oil company that wants to advance its interest in Russia, let's say, or straight up bribery, or simply by our purchases of Russian oil and gas. I mean, what do we think happens to the money that we spend on Russian oil and gas, or Saudi oil, or Nigerian oil, or Congolese cobalt, and the list goes on and on. Even if this is not straight up bribery, as it often is, even in the cases where we are simply buying this product, we know that it's being stolen. We know that we're in bed with a corrupt regime. So I think the trick is to see these things as transnational networks of money and power, where the corporate interests in Houston, the political interests in the Kremlin, and a despot clinging to power in Zimbabwe, they all have their interests are more interlocked with each other than with any of the, if you like, ordinary people in whose name these people wield power.
I want to read, Sarah, to you and get you to comment rather first on a quote. This is from an interview with the author of another book on this, American Kleptocracy, where he's talking about one Ukrainian kleptocrat in particular and why he puts his money into the United States. And here's the quote. What he, this kleptocrat, ended up doing was moving that money not into Manhattan high-rises, the South Florida real estate landscape, or places in Southern California. He ended up going, of all places, to Cleveland, Ohio. He ended up pouring hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of unaccounted foreign money, anonymous money, into small towns, steel towns, factory towns, and manufacturing plants across the American Midwest, across the Rust Belt, across the American heartland. I mean, I guess I don't want to, hammer this point too much, but again, this is not what we think of when we think of kleptocracies, investing in parts of America that many people tend to think of as yesterday's news, not tomorrow's news. Do we have to rethink our vision of what this is?
Yes, and I want to go back to the rethinking. So quite interestingly, those very places are places where there is an epidemic of evictions. So here, again, we're used to thinking of kleptocracy as leading to poverty and conflict in places like Angola or Nigeria or Afghanistan. But the very same poverty is being produced in our own Western countries. And it's being produced by, in the case you referred to, a Ukrainian kleptocrat. But once again, I want to bring this back home. I want to say that, yes, Washington resembles Moscow way more than we want to think about it, or we want to understand. And so I'm not trying to make a false equivalency here, but I do think there's more of a real equivalency than we're even willing to let ourselves understand, because it's not just that we're selling Ukrainian buildings. Let me give you one example. President Biden just nominated Sarah Bloom Raskin to be vice president of the Federal Reserve, our central bank. Ms. Raskin had as a private citizen, said that it would be important for the financial sector to analyze climate risk as part of the systemic risk that might affect the financial system. For that, she was refused even a hearing, even a vote in committee. Why? Because a key U.S. senator is completely beholden to the fossil fuel industry in the United States. So the point is that kleptocrats don't just use financial and such institutions to hide their money. Inside government, they actually bend and twist the levers of government, the very institutions and agencies that they control, and they use their power over and influence over elected officials to force the government to serve their purposes and to ignore really obvious public concerns like the potential effect of climate crisis on the financial system.
Oliver, this sounds like law enforcement worldwide is bringing a knife to a gunfight. It sounds like they're hopelessly mismatched, in which case, is there anything that can be done about this?
Yeah, I mean, there are some places that are better than others. The US does at least try to bring these cases. The UK, I'm not sure we've ever bothered. Most European countries don't bother. And then in places like Ukraine or Russia, the law enforcement are actually part of the kleptocratic systems themselves. They're essentially the foot soldiers of the kleptocratic government. And, what can we do about it? Well, we need to think transnationally, just as the kleptocrats act transnationally, as Tom and Sarah said. We're talking about a global class, essentially, a nomadic class of kleptocrats with no loyalty to any one country, only loyalty to the wealth which they're trying to extract. So we need to approach them transnationally. There's been some really impressive advances in journalism by groups like the ICIJ and the OCCRP, who work in these networks to try and investigate these crimes in multiple countries simultaneously. Our police services need to be able to do this too. There's been some signs in the last 6 weeks that the White House and the other G7 countries have been chivying police services towards doing this. They got this what they call a kleptocatcher, slightly unfortunate name, but that's what they're calling it. And that's great. If they can share information, that's good. But they also need to have information to share. And this really gets to the heart of what I think needs doing most urgently, which is it's just incredibly hard to hide your ownership. Incredibly easy to hide your ownership of stolen wealth behind shell companies from multiple jurisdictions, whether those are limited partnerships from some of the Canadian provinces, whether that's LLCs from some of the more opaque US states, or whether that's limited liability partnerships from the UK, or companies or partnerships from elsewhere. There are so many options to choose from. And when they're combined together into these chains of structures, they become almost unbreakable, even by the most potent police services. So what we really desperately need is proper transparency of ownership, verified transparency, so we can cut all the way through these corporate structures and see who actually owns what. And that will really expose so many of these corporations as total fictions, which exist only to obfuscate the property of the oligarchs who are increasingly dominating the world. And if, as ordinary citizens, we wish to fight back and try and reclaim some power for democracy against kleptocracy, what we need is knowledge to empower us to know who owns what, who owns our countries, who's funding our elections, who's buying our politicians. And that can only be done if we can see who owns the companies that are doing it. So true ownership transparency is something that's absolutely crucial. And there are steps in this direction. There have been commitments from the Canadian government. There's been commitments from the US government, some commitments as well from the UK government, and also within the EU, which is all great, but it's happening way too slowly. The money is being stolen. By some estimates, more than $1 trillion a year is being stolen and hidden offshore. All of that money is money that does not want to be identified and exposed. And the longer we leave this, the harder it's going to be to essentially force its owners to reveal what they own.
Sarah, we're literally down to our last 30 seconds here. How much hope do you hold that the prescription that Oliver just gave is possible?
I don't believe in hope. I believe in determination. It's up to us, the people, to understand that this problem is exactly as existential as both Tom and Oliver have described it as being.
Well, we'll go with determination as opposed to hope then. That sounds like very good advice. Sarah Chase, Tom Burgess, Oliver Bullough, it's really good of you to spend so much time with us on TVO tonight. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks.
In a globally connected food system, a major disruption in one part of the world can have ripple effects far beyond their origin, sometimes with devastating consequences. War, such as the one in Ukraine, is just such a disruption. How will it be felt across the world? Let's ask. In Ede, Netherlands, the former head of the UN World Food Programme, Ertharin Cousin, who is currently a distinguished fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and CEO of Food Systems for the Future. In Vancouver, British Columbia, Lenore Newman, director of the Food and Agriculture Institute at the University of the Fraser Valley and a Canada Research Chair in Food Security and Environment. And in Guelph, Ontario, Evan Fraser, director of the Errol Food Institute and a professor of geography at the University of Guelph. And we're glad that the three of you could spare some time for us here on TVO tonight. I'm going to start our discussion just by reading an excerpt from the New York Times, this from last week, and it goes like this. For the global food market, there are few worse countries to be in conflict than Russia and Ukraine. Over the past 5 years, they have together accounted for nearly 30% of the exports of the world's wheat, 17% of corn, 32% of barley, a crucial source of animal feed, and 75% of sunflower seed oil, an important cooking oil in some parts of the world. David M. Beasley, the executive director of the United Nations World Food Programme, said Ukraine has only compounded a catastrophe on top of a catastrophe. There is no precedent even close to this since World War II. Ertharin, I wonder, having heard what David Beasley had to say about this, I wonder how you would characterize the pressure now being felt on the global food supply.
David's absolutely right. This is a looming, as the Secretary General has said, hurricane on the horizon. I was serving as the U.S. Ambassador for Food and Agriculture in the aftermath of the 2007-8 food crisis and during the 2011 high food price hunger crisis. And what we saw then was that was when hunger spiked around the world to about 1 billion people. And we know that today, as we are speaking, there are 811 million people who are food insecure. And that number increased by about almost 100 million as a result of COVID. And there's an expectation that this situation, and this is just a tipping point of challenges that had already begun because of lack of fertilizer, high gas prices, the spike in wheat futures. And then you have this availability challenge that results from the lack of export from Russia and Ukraine. And so that number of 811 billion, some are speculating could again increase to over 1 billion people. And the number of those who are critically, acutely hungry could increase from the 276 million today to another 100 to 150 to over 350 million people who are acutely hungry. And that means without assistance, there will be famines.
Evan, you just heard me read that quote from David Beasley from the UN World Food Programme saying this was a catastrophe on top of a catastrophe. Is that being overly dramatic?
No, I mean, I agree with Ambassador Cousin here. I mean, and the head of the World Food Program. Any one of the problems that Ambassador Cousin just listed on their own wouldn't necessarily trigger a global crisis. But when you've already got high food price inflation, supply chain bottlenecks, low food stocks. This is another thing. The United Nations tracks something called the supply to use ratio, which basically is a fancy way of saying how much food we've got versus how much we use. And the supply to use ratio is at its lowest point since I think 2015 or 2016. So you put all of these things together and you do have layers of catastrophe and a cascading ripple effect that means that when you take Russia and Ukraine, which are amongst the world's top 5 wheat exporters, out of the equation for this year, wheat importing countries such as Egypt and North Africa, the Middle East, will be in desperately troubled situations, and then the looming specter of famine and skyrocketing hunger around the planet. It's a terrifying moment.
Lenore Newman, if you're a farmer in Ukraine right now, you obviously can't do what you want to do when there are bombs dropping all around you. So what's not happening right now that should be happening?
Yes, well, obviously in Ukraine, we are seeing total disruption of the farming cycle for the most part. It's a long-held historic truth that war is particularly hard on farmers. But I think I have to stress, as my colleagues mentioned, it's the waves of disruption flowing out from that are particularly damaging. And I don't know that we've entirely mentioned yet the disruption of fertilizer flow from Russia and Ukraine is also critical, and that's impacting South America and Africa and well, the entire world as well. And as it has been mentioned as well, it's on top of 3 years of basic constant disruption, climate change, pandemic. And I'm usually an optimist, and I usually say, well, one-off situation, the food system is really good at being resilient. This time, it's there's fatigue. There's disaster fatigue, one could say.
Ambassador Cousin, let me pick up on the fertilizer angle that Lenore Newman just brought up, because it's not only Russia and Ukraine, but Belarus as well, that account for a huge portion of the world's fertilizers. What are the ripple effects of price for fertilizer going through the roof?
Last week I was in Rwanda, where I met with the Minister of Agriculture, and we went out to visit with farmers. And there's no fertilizer. And any farmer will tell you the crop that grows most productively in Rwanda is potatoes. And you can't grow fertilizer without potatoes. And the FAO has told us that up to any 30% reduction in fertilizer represents a 30% reduction in yield that could potentially impact about 100 million people not having access to food. So you think about the fact that there's a higher food price in the global food system and less production, particularly with smallholder farmers in places that are, as a group, net importers. And so you have less produced locally and regionally, and as a result, you have higher food prices for imports, which creates a challenge that we traditionally are talking about. How do we provide support for those who are chronically hungry? What we're talking about is working people who will no longer have the ability to afford bread. And so that means that we need to increase production of fertilizers to ensure that we're moving fertilizer into places where it's necessary, like Latin America and Africa, as well as in parts of Asia, where the 500 million smallholder farmers feed about 80% of the population in their countries.
Well, Evan, the trick with that, of course, is that energy prices are going through the roof as well. How do you move that fertilizer to where it needs to go to when you've got to be spending 2 or 3 times as much for energy?
Well, I mean, again, we're just describing the same problem. I mean, this is another aspect of these layers of catastrophe the world is facing right now. And I think there's an important element that is worth doubling down on, because in a place like Canada, soils are pretty deep. pretty organic, pretty well managed in general. So there will be a lot of surplus nutrients from last year's fertilizer that will help buffer most Canadian farmers, not all, not perfectly, but will help buffer most Canadian farmers from not being able to put as much fertilizer on this year because of the high costs. A place like Rwanda with very, very sandy, thin soils, they need the annual inputs of fertilizer quite desperately. So once again, we see a wedge effect driving a wedge between the rich north and the global south, so-called, and again we see a thing that exacerbates, or a function that exacerbates, inequality in this world. And again, we just see another layer of this catastrophe unfolding in front of us.
Lenore, can you tell how much of the problems that you've all been describing so far are the result of the war, and how much are the result of sanctions that have been put on Russia? Can we tell that yet?
I don't think we can know entirely yet. And I do think it's really important that the problem is these problems are tangled with everything else going on in the food system. And so when we look at Ukraine and Russia being large exporters of major crops such as wheat, that's important, but we need to remember they're not large producers when we look at the whole pie. And we could easily adapt if the rest of the world was just totally fine. But of course, it isn't. We have crippling labor crisis. We have the climate crisis. Usually, we would be already figuring out how to account for the missing production, and we wouldn't be worrying about what effect the sanctions were having, what effect the war was having. The reason we're worrying is everything else is just spread absolutely wafer thin.
Evan, anything you want to add to that in terms of where you think the preponderance of responsibility lies, sanctions versus the war?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tangled web. It's a Gordian knot. I mean, I don't think we can disentangle these things. I guess my one concern, though, in this conversation is that it really does put us in a headspace, and I don't think this is a helpful headspace, that we can solve this problem simply by boosting production all over the world. And I think that what this is revealing is that at a deep and fundamental level, there are so many interlocking vulnerabilities in the food system that we need a much more fundamental food system transformation, and that we need to help farmers get access to fertilizer as a short-term measure. We need to make sure that say Canadian wheat gets into places like North Africa. Those are really good short-term strategies, supporting the World Food Program to do the delivery of the food aid. But that isn't going to solve the long-term structural vulnerabilities that we're seeing and we're falling prey to this year. And that requires a deeper, more nuanced strategy.
No, I take your point on that, but in the immediate situation that the world finds itself in right now, and Earther and Cousin, I'll bring you back in on this, I guess we need to have a better understanding of which parts of the world, either right now or are soon going to be, facing the brunt of the food shortage that you've all described.
Well, we know that the direct effects of the war will affect those who are net importers, historical net importers. We've already seen and witnessed protest because of high food prices. There's an expectation that other countries like Egypt, that are large importers from Ukraine and Russia, will also be immediately affected. But there are also those countries that are far afield from Russian or Ukrainian imports, like Haiti, where because of higher food prices, high debt levels of the country, and inability to support the purchase of commodities at a higher price, and the challenges and impact of higher oil prices and lack of production in the country, that we know they are, as you think about a hotspot country, that's one of those countries that would easily be a hotspot country. But we can walk around the globe and identify those countries. For example, let me just add one more on here, and that's in the West Africa and the Sahel, where we recognize that the opportunity to increase production there, in a follow-on to the challenges that they've been having with climate-related poor agricultural production, the opportunity to invest in increased access to foods the governments don't have the capital. And so trying to identify how we can not only provide the immediate humanitarian support that is necessary in those places, but also the tools that are necessary, because we are 3 months away from the beginning of the planting season in the Sahel. What is the work that the international community must do now to invest in providing the seeds and tools that are required to ensure that we don't expand the challenge even further, because we failed to provide those farmers with the tools that they need. So I'll stop there, because I can walk you around the globe and tell you how this is going to affect so many countries. But that just giving you those examples, hopefully your viewers will recognize that this is a challenge that is affecting different parts of the globe, and it will affect in different ways, but the outcome will, in each of those countries, is increased number of hungry people.
No, indeed. I take your point on that. And I guess, Evan, I mean, this may be a bit of a nuanced look at it, but not every country presumably will be affected in the same way, because some countries depend on, for example, wheat in their diet more than other countries do. Can you give us a bit of a list of countries which would be sort of more dependent as opposed to less on wheat, and therefore this will hit them harder?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important nuance, and you know, something like the fertilizer crisis is affecting farmers everywhere. The specific role of Ukraine and Russia as key global wheat exporters will disproportionately affect North Africa and the Middle East, which are fundamentally have a lot of wheat in their diets, as opposed to, say, Asian countries where wheat's super important, but it isn't as central, say, to the diets as rice is. So again, all eyes for me are on North Africa, East Africa, the Middle East in particular. Those are wheat-based countries. They import a tremendous amount of Russian and Ukrainian wheat. We know that about 10 years ago in the 2011 food price crisis, food prices started to rise on the backs of poor harvests in China and Russia, which meant that Russia that year chose to stop exporting into international markets to anywhere like they normally do. And again, it was exactly in the countries that Ambassador Cousin just listed, Haiti plus and countries in the North Africa and the Middle East, where we start seeing political protest. And it's not just hunger, it's people taking to the streets in anger over political corruption and all sorts of other things, but sparked by upset over the rising price of bread in many instances.
Well, that's a great point. Lenore Newman, I mean, we got the Arab Spring, I think, or at least those countries got the Arab Spring, kick-started in part by food insecurity at the time. What part of the globe are you looking at right now in terms of where political and social instability might start because of the food crisis we're entering now?
Well, I think one of the things is it's going to hit us here at home as well, which is a little unusual. We're usually quite sheltered because of all the resiliency in the system. But one of the things I'm watching carefully is the North Americans are quite stretched right now because of inflation. And they are going to be walking into stores and going, wow, things are really expensive. They're going to mentally shift more of their budget into food, because you can't shrink that budget too much because we have to eat. And that means people will be spending less on other areas of the economy. And people are also going to be even more financially stressed. So I think this is a crisis that actually spreads right around the world. And there's very few areas that are going to be bystanders. Of course, we're going to see the most serious hunger in the Middle East, in Northern Africa. We're going to see a bit of a supply crisis in South America because of the lack of fertilizer. But I think even here at home, we're not going to be playing our usual role of watching it unfold. We're going to see it at the grocery shelf. And we're very spoiled. We're used to spending between 6 and 10% of our take-home pay on food. For the first time in a long time, we're seeing that number rise quite rapidly. And so I think even here, it's going to have political implications, this crisis.
Can I get Ambassador Cousin on that as well? Do you imagine social and political instability in North America and Western Europe as being a potential outcome here?
It could happen. Here's the reality. Many families, particularly the working poor families in North America and in Europe, are experiencing higher housing costs, higher fuel costs. There's already a post-COVID, because of supply chains, higher food costs. Some economists are suggesting that globally food costs could rise another 10 to 15%. That is a reality that will affect those whose incomes have only risen probably in comparison about 3%. And so the challenge of families trying to meet all of their needs will result in the kind of protests and political and political issues that we saw in the early days of COVID, with those long lines at food banks when families could no longer afford food, or empty shelves when when the effects of COVID limited the supply chain, affected supply chains and products on shelves. And so the possibility of that happening is quite high. But the opportunity for us to address that through food substitutions, to moving foods earlier, to making ensuring that we have our social safety nets in our countries as viable as possible, is also quite important for us to perform that work right now on the front end.
Well, Evan, let me read this off of National Public Radio's website, because the author of this piece suggests another solution here. And here we go. Even with the loss of the contributions to the food supply from Ukraine and Russia, there would still technically be enough quantity left to feed the world. In other words, the only problem will be the increased price of that food. This in turn suggests that the immediate solution will be monetary. Okay, Evan, take us through that. Do you think this is a problem that money can solve?
Well, it's such a good question, and it's such an interesting quotation, because it's, on some levels, the author of that statement is absolutely correct. If you add up all of the calories available on the planet and you divide it by all the people, there's more than enough. It's 2,800 dietary calories available per person per day, but they're not distributed very well. They're also not necessarily the healthy calories. There's a lot of carbohydrate in there, and there's not enough fruits and vegetables, so there's a nutritional deficit going on. And then there's food waste. About a third of the food we produce is wasted. So on that level, it's not a problem that will simply be solved by producing more. If it were only that simple, actually this wouldn't be as complicated a conversation to have. But what we need to be doing is, I think, in the very, very short term, supporting organizations like the World Food Program, hoping that the Canadian wheat harvest that's coming off, the winter wheat harvest that's coming off in the next couple of months, is robust. Doing whatever we can to keep the global trade mechanisms going, to get the fertilizer that we've got moved, to get the grains we've got moved, and working at a multilateral level on that one. But at the same time, we have to be doing, I think, two additional things that are medium and longer term strategies. And one, Ambassador Cousin just mentioned, we need a robust social safety net to protect the people who are left out of the modern world, that aren't benefiting from economic growth and opportunities, the marginalized communities on this planet, of which there are far too many. We need to have a safety net to protect them, or those people will be the source of tremendous unrest and human suffering. And then I think there's a wake-up call that the fundamental assumptions of the world food system, good grain, good weather, seamless trade, all these things that we sort of assumed over the 20th and early 21st century were sort of fundamental. Well, those assumptions are pretty rickety right now. And so I think we have to shorten supply chains, build resilience into the system. That will cost money, which redoubles, it increases the importance of doing social safety nets. But I think it's in the medium and long term that we need to be building resilience in our systems, and in the short term, hoping that we can get prairie grain out to Africa to keep prices down there.
Well, I should follow up with Lenore Newman on that very angle. We do, the prairies, right? Lots of wheat there. Saskatchewan, lots of potash there, which you need for fertilizer. How can Canada be part of the solution here?
Well, I think we already are part of the solution, because the market is pushing the planting of more spring wheat than we usually would. And Canada does play an interesting role in that we plant more spring wheat than a lot of other regions. So we do have the ability to pivot and feed into that supply. But I do feel Evan's raised a really critical point in that we're playing reactive politics here constantly. The last 4 years have been the food system stumbling from crisis to crisis. And the quote that you gave us is interesting because over the last few years, we've seen government write us checks for COVID, and everyone was totally, yeah, we need to do that. And then recently for fuel costs, we are getting another little check, and it's a bandage, and it's important. We have to do bandage type things, but eventually you do bleed to death if you only use bandages. And I think Evan is correct. We need to look at whether this idea of a globalized food system is now under threat by a larger series of interlocking crises. And yeah, the medium and long-term things, we need to start thinking about resilient supply that's local, that's intensive. We need to start seeing how we move surplus more rapidly around the system as it's needed. I think, to use an overused phrase from the pandemic, we have to accept there is a new normal in the food system, and it's not as pleasant and easy as the period between the end of World War II and about 10 or 20 years ago. And we need to adapt to that.
Well, you've all made that abundantly clear, unfortunately, during the course of our conversation here, but I think our viewers and listeners know a lot more about this now than they did half an hour ago. So can I thank Lenore Newman in Vancouver, British Columbia, Evan Fraser in Guelph, Ontario, and Ertharin Cousin in Netherlands for joining us on TVO tonight and making us all a lot more knowledgeable about this issue. Many thanks, you three.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Thursday, April 7th, 2022. Tomorrow, Nam Kiwanuka talks to Canadian folk legend Bruce Cockburn about more than 50 years of songwriting, making music, and figuring out where those lions are. Hope you'll be with her for that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. And Nam, we'll see you here tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.